First up, let's discuss the basics of a transaction and how a transaction works inside of SQL Server. Transactions are required because most of the time when we're performing operations inside of SQL, having to modify data, we're going to be dealing with multiple tables. So for example, maybe we need to insert a brand new order and then the line items associated with that order. Or we need to modify a contact and the employee details to go along with that. Or maybe what we need to do is delete a customer and all the addresses that are associated with that customer. Well, what happens if only part of that operation succeeds? For example, what happens if I insert in an order, but we don't wind up with the details of that order? How do we then have to go back in and fix that? And obviously then notice that we wind up with a lot of possible problems inside of our database when it comes to data integrity. This is where transactions come into play. Transactions will allow us to control the entirety of an operation and ensure that everything's going to succeed or everything is going to get rolled back should something fail. Transactions must meet what's known as an ACID test. The ACID test is comprised of 4 different components, with the A standing for atomic, which just simply means that the entire operation must succeed or the entire operation must fail, and it must do so as a single unit. The C stands for consistent, meaning that once the operation is complete, my database must be left in a consistent or in a valid state. This might mean that everything was written out to the database, or it might mean that everything was rolled back and we are now back in the same state in which we started. Every transaction must also be isolated, simply meaning that somebody else's operation at the same time that I'm working on my data is not allowed to impact my operation. And then finally, last but not least, is durable, which means that once SQL has told me that it has written the data out to disk, that should that server lose power, that my data is still safe. SQL transactions do meet the atomic test. Believe it or not, if you've gone through any of the prior demos where we did an update or an insert or delete, you actually already use transactions. The reason for that is SQL has a default of what's known as an automatic transaction, which means that each individual insert, update, or delete statement is in and of itself a transaction, meaning that should something fail in the middle of an update statement, maybe only one row is going to fail out, the entire operation will fail out. You do have the ability to configure what are known as implicit transactions, and there are other database providers that will utilize implicit transactions. And an implicit transaction means that the moment you begin modifying your database, it's automatically going to start up a transaction for you, and it's up to you to explicitly commit that at the end. Generally speaking, you don't see that implemented or turned on in SQL Server. Now that leads us perfectly into managing our transactions manually. There's 3 main commands that we have access to when it comes to managing a transaction manually. We have begin transaction, which of course is going to mark the start of a transaction. We have commit transaction, which we're going to execute once we know that everything is set up the way that we want it to be. And then finally, last but not least, we have rollback transaction, which we're going to use if we decide that, something isn't quite right. Maybe we got an error message and we want to roll everything back. Let's take a real quick look at how we can implement a transaction. I'm going to bring up my management studio here, connect to AdventureWorks. All that we have to do to implement a transaction is just simply say begin transaction. And I'm going to say update, and let's say person contact. Let's say set last name equal to Harrison. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to execute this just the way that it sits right now. And you'll notice that it comes back and it tells me that we have modified 19,972 rows. The reason, of course, for that is that we did not specify a where statement. So when you just do an update, it just does everything. And in fact, you'll notice that if I come down here and I say select, and let's say first name, last name from person contact, let's just execute that part. We'll use the selection there for that. You'll notice, sure enough, just as promised, everybody is now Harrison, which is not really what we want. So we've obviously made a mistake. We want to roll this back. And the way that we roll this back is by utilizing a rollback transaction statement. And so if I highlight that rollback transaction, you'll notice that it just simply tells me that the command completed successfully. But if I now come back down here and I say first name, last name from person contact, you'll notice that everybody is back to just the way that they were before. I'm just going to go back and clean up my code here real quick. Let me get my semicolons in. Try and be a good developer here. So I got my semicolons back into there. But the big takeaway that I want you to get out of this is that because of the fact that I called rollback transaction, it rolled back my operation. Now remember that rollback, and commit for that matter, will only work if you called begin transaction.